Listen carefully, Pentagon. Russia and three African nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, just finalized a military alliance in Moscow that terminates your control over West Africa. You thought we'd beg for American military aid forever. You believed Africa Command meant permanent dominance. You assumed we couldn't survive without Western weapons. You were dead wrong. We signed a strategic partnership with Russia, giving them military bases, intelligence access, and operational control across our territories. Russian forces are replacing American forces right now, and your 65 years of military monopoly in Africa just ended permanently. Let me tell you exactly what happened in Moscow and why this military alliance between Russia and the Alliance of Sahel states fundamentally transforms African security architecture forever. On the 14th of October 2025, military delegations from Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger traveled to Moscow and finalized a comprehensive military alliance with the Russian Federation. This was not a symbolic cooperation agreement. This was a strategic military partnership covering equipment supply, training programs, intelligence sharing, advisor deployment, and joint operations coordination. Russia committed to provide advanced weapon systems, military vehicles, air defense capabilities, and combat helicopters that Western partners refused to supply or supplied with conditions that undermined our sovereignty. The Alliance of Sahel states, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, formed this confederation in September 2023 specifically to build independent security architecture free from Western military control. We withdrew from Economic Community of West African States in January 2024 because ECOWAS served as instrument of French and American military influence in our region. We terminated defense agreements with France. We expelled French military forces from our territories. We closed American military bases in Niger. And we built alternative security partnerships with Russia that provide military support without political conditions that compromise our sovereignty. Listen carefully, Pentagon. You are watching formation of entirely new security bloc in West Africa that operates outside American military control. 3 countries with combined population exceeding 80 million people, combined territory exceeding 3 million square kilometers, and combined military forces exceeding 150,000 personnel just aligned with Russia rather than accepting continued Western military dominance. This is not marginal development in peripheral region. This is fundamental transformation of African security architecture that terminates assumptions about permanent American military influence in West Africa. Western media portrayed this alliance as opportunistic partnership driven by anti-Western sentiment. That analysis completely misunderstands what actually happened. We built strategic military partnership with Russia because Western military partnerships failed to meet our security needs. French military forces operated in Mali for nearly 10 years under Operation Barkhane, and security situation deteriorated continuously during that entire period. American military support focused on training programs and light equipment that proved inadequate against well-armed insurgent groups. Western partners provided military aid with political conditions requiring governance reforms, human rights compliance monitoring, and operational restrictions that prevented effective counterterrorism operations. Russia offered fundamentally different partnership model. Russian military support comes without political conditions regarding our internal governance. Russian equipment includes advanced weapon systems that Western partners withheld because they feared those capabilities might be used in ways that violated Western human rights standards. Russian military advisors focus on operational effectiveness rather than process compliance with Western military doctrine. Russian intelligence sharing provides actionable information without restrictions on how we use that intelligence in combat operations. The military alliance finalized in October 2025 formalized security cooperation that already existed informally for over 2 years. Russian military advisors arrived in Burkina Faso in late 2023. Russian helicopters began flying combat missions over Malian territory in early 2024. Russian armored vehicles started appearing in Niger in mid-2024. The Moscow Agreement transformed informal cooperation into formal strategic partnership with institutional structures, coordinated command systems, and long-term commitments that guarantee Russian military support regardless of Western pressure. Pentagon officials issued warnings about Russian military expansion in Africa for several years before this alliance materialized. Those warnings proved completely accurate in predicting what would happen. Pentagon analysts correctly forecasted that Russia would establish military bases in West Africa. They accurately predicted that Russian private military companies would deploy across Sahel region. They precisely anticipated that African countries would grant Russia access to strategic minerals and natural resources in exchange for military support. Every single Pentagon prediction about Russian military presence in Africa came true exactly as they warned. But Pentagon analysis fundamentally misunderstood why those predictions would materialize and what they would mean for African security. Pentagon treated Russian military expansion as threat to American interests and Western security architecture. Pentagon presented Russian bases as danger to stability. Pentagon characterized Russian advisors as destabilizing influence. Pentagon portrayed Russian equipment as inferior alternative to Western systems. All of that analysis revealed Pentagon's real concern was not African security but American military dominance. Listen carefully, Washington. Your predictions were accurate, but your conclusions were completely wrong. Russian military bases exist in West Africa today. Russian advisors train our forces daily. Russian intelligence supports our operations continuously. Russian equipment defends our territory effectively. And all of that represents improvement in African security rather than threat to stability. Pentagon warnings about Russian expansion were self-serving analysis designed to maintain American military monopoly rather than genuine concern about African security needs. Pentagon's fundamental error was assuming that American military presence in Africa served African interests, rather than recognizing that Western military dominance primarily served Western strategic objectives. French military forces in Sahel protected French uranium mines and maintained French political influence. American military bases in West Africa supported American counterterrorism operations and provided staging areas for American regional interventions. Western military aid came with political conditions that advanced Western governance preferences. Every aspect of Western military presence in Africa prioritized Western interests over African sovereignty. Russian military partnership operates differently. Russian support aims to strengthen African governments rather than reshape African governance according to foreign preferences. Russian advisors focus on defeating insurgent threats rather than implementing democratic reforms. Russian equipment comes without operational restrictions that prevented us from conducting effective military operations. Russian intelligence sharing provides information we can actually use in combat rather than intelligence with caveats that make it operationally useless. Pentagon officials warned that granting Russia military access to West Africa would compromise African sovereignty because Russian presence would give Moscow leverage over African governments. That warning revealed profound hypocrisy. Western military presence in Africa already compromised African sovereignty for decades. French military bases gave Paris leverage that France used repeatedly to influence African politics. American military aid came with conditions that forced African governments to accept American governance preferences. Western intelligence cooperation required African countries to align their foreign policies with Western interests. Pentagon's concern about Russian leverage was projection of exactly what Western military presence already imposed on African countries. The alliance of Sahel states represents more than military cooperation agreement between three countries. AES is comprehensive alternative to Western-dominated security architecture that governed West Africa since independence. ECOWAS operated as instrument of French political influence with military intervention mechanisms that France used to overthrow governments and impose regime changes. African Union security frameworks reflected Western preferences regarding humanitarian intervention and responsibility to protect doctrines that legitimized Western military interventions. Regional military structures like G5 Sahel depended entirely on Western funding and equipment that gave Western powers control over African security operations. AES breaks completely from that Western-controlled architecture. Our alliance is funded by our own resources rather than depending on Western military aid. Our equipment comes from Russia rather than relying on Western weapons supplies. Our operations follow our strategic priorities rather than accommodating Western political conditions. Our command structures answer to African governments rather than coordinating with French or American military headquarters. AES represents genuine African security sovereignty for first time since independence. Listen carefully, Brussels and Washington. You are watching construction of alternative security order in West Africa that excludes Western control. Three countries just demonstrated that African nations can build effective military partnerships independent of Western involvement. We can secure Russian military support without Western permission. We can conduct military operations without Western approval. We can defend our territories without Western assistance. AES proves that Western military monopoly in Africa was never actually necessary for African security, it only served Western strategic interests. The military alliance between AES and Russia adds external partnership to our independent regional security structure. Russia provides equipment and training that enhances our military capabilities. Russian advisors bring combat experience from Syria and Ukraine that improves our operational effectiveness. Russian intelligence sharing gives us information about insurgent movements that Western partners never provided. Russian political support shields us from Western pressure regarding human rights issues that previously limited our military operations. Partnership with Russia makes AES substantially more powerful than any individual member country could be alone. Western officials predicted that AES would collapse because our three countries lack resources to sustain independent security operations. They forecasted that we would request return of French forces within months after expelling them. They anticipated that we would negotiate new agreements with United States to restore American military presence. Every single Western prediction about AES failure proved completely false. AES survived more than 2 years since formation in September 2023. Our security situation improved rather than deteriorating after expelling Western forces. Our partnership with Russia provided alternative military support that replaced Western assistance. Our combined resources proved sufficient to sustain independent operations without Western funding. Pentagon's military dominance in Africa depended on assumption that African countries had no alternative to Western military partnerships. That assumption was accurate for decades after independence. Soviet Union provided some military support to certain African countries during Cold War, but Soviet assistance was limited and came with political conditions requiring socialist governance models. After Cold War ended in early 1990s, Western military monopoly became absolute because no other major power offered comprehensive military support to African countries. That monopoly generated complacency in Pentagon planning. American military officials assumed that Africa Command and forward bases would maintain American military presence indefinitely. Pentagon treated military aid programs as instruments of permanent influence rather than partnerships that needed to deliver results for African partners. Western military support came with increasing political conditions regarding democracy, human rights, and governance that prioritized Western values over African security needs. Pentagon never seriously considered possibility that African countries might build alternative security partnerships if Western military support proved inadequate. Russia's return to Africa as major military partner destroyed Pentagon's monopoly permanently. Russian military support offers comprehensive alternative to Western partnerships. Russia can provide advanced weapons systems comparable to Western equipment. Russian military advisors bring combat experience from actual wars rather than peacetime training exercises. Russian intelligence capabilities rival Western surveillance networks. Russian political support shields African partners from Western pressure regarding human rights and governance issues. Russia delivers everything Pentagon provided without political conditions that undermined African sovereignty. Listen carefully. Pentagon officials planning Africa strategy. Your military monopoly ended because you treated African security needs as secondary to American political preferences. You provided military aid with conditions that prevented effective operations. You withheld advanced weapons because you feared African countries might use those capabilities in ways that violated Western human rights standards. You restricted intelligence sharing because you wanted to control how African partners use that information. You prioritized process compliance over operational results. And you assumed African countries would permanently accept that inadequate support because alternatives did not exist. Russia provided alternative. And African countries chose Russian partnership because it serves our security needs better than Western partnerships that served Western interests. Pentagon's era of military dominance in Africa did not end because Russia forced us to switch partners. It ended because Pentagon's military support failed to meet our security requirements while Russian support succeeds. Russian military alliance with Alliance of Sahel states was only possible because China provided economic support that reduced our dependence on Western aid and trade. China built infrastructure across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger that improved our transportation networks, expanded our electricity generation, and modernized our telecommunications systems. Chinese companies invested in mining operations that increased our export revenues and provided funds for military spending. Chinese trade partnerships offered markets for our products without political conditions that Western trade agreements imposed. That economic engagement with China created fiscal independence that made Russian military partnership politically viable. When France threatened to cut development aid if we expelled French forces, Chinese investment filled that gap immediately. When United States threatened sanctions if we partnered with Russian military advisors, Chinese trade provided alternative markets that absorbed our exports. When Western financial institutions threatened to restrict our access to international capital if we aligned with Russia, Chinese development banks offered financing with no political conditions regarding our security partnerships. Pentagon warnings about Russian military expansion in Africa completely ignored China's economic role in enabling that expansion. Pentagon analysts focused exclusively on Russian military activities without recognizing that Chinese economic support made Russian partnerships sustainable. Pentagon treated Russian presence as isolated development rather than understanding that China-Russia cooperation created comprehensive alternative to Western influence that combined economic development with military security. Listen carefully, Washington. You cannot counter Russian military presence in Africa without addressing Chinese economic engagement that makes Russian partnership viable. Threatening to cut military aid will not work because Russian support replaces American assistance. Imposing sanctions will not succeed because Chinese trade prevents economic isolation. Pressuring African governments regarding human rights will fail because Russian political support shields us from Western criticism. Pentagon's military monopoly ended because China and Russia together offer comprehensive alternative to Western partnerships that works better for African interests. The military alliance between Alliance of Sahel states and Russia establishes precedent that fundamentally transforms assumptions about African security architecture. We proved that African countries can successfully expel Western military forces without collapsing into chaos. We demonstrated that African nations can build effective security partnerships with non-Western powers that deliver better results than Western military support. We showed that African governments can resist Western pressure regarding human rights and governance without suffering catastrophic economic consequences. Every assumption Pentagon made about African dependence on Western military support proved false. Other African countries are watching what happened in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger very carefully. They observed that we expelled French forces and security situation improved rather than deteriorating. They noticed that we closed American military bases and maintained operational capabilities through Russian support. They saw that we resisted Western pressure regarding human rights and sustained international relationships through Chinese economic partnerships. They learned that Western predictions about our collapse were completely wrong, and alternatives to Western military dominance actually work. That lesson will reshape African security choices across entire continent. Countries that previously accepted Western military presence because they believed no alternatives existed now know that Russian partnership offers viable option. Governments that tolerated Western political conditions because they thought military aid depended on compliance now understand that Russian support comes without governance requirements. African nations that assumed they needed Western approval for security policies now recognize they can operate independently if willing to accept manageable diplomatic costs. Listen carefully, Pentagon and NATO headquarters. You are watching beginning of comprehensive transformation of African security architecture away from Western dominance toward multipolar system where African countries choose partners based on effectiveness rather than accepting Western control because alternatives supposedly did not exist. Alliance of Sahel states proved alternatives exist and work better. That proof will influence African security decisions for decades. Specific African countries are already studying what happened in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger with intense interest. Chad expelled American forces from Strategic Air Base in April 2024 after observing that Burkina Faso suffered no catastrophic consequences from closing Western military facilities. Senegal's new government elected in March 2024 immediately began reviewing defense agreements with France after watching Mali successfully terminate French military presence. Central African Republic expanded partnership with Russian military advisors throughout 2024 and 2025 after observing Russian effectiveness in Sahel region. These are not isolated incidents. These are early indicators of systematic shift across African continent away from Western military partnerships toward alternatives that serve African sovereignty better. The template we established through Alliance of Sahel States provides roadmap that other African countries can follow. Step 1. Terminate defense agreements with former colonial powers that contain provisions allowing foreign military intervention in domestic politics. Step 2. Expel foreign military bases that serve external strategic interests rather than host nation security needs. Step 3. Build alternative security partnerships with powers willing to provide military support without political conditions regarding governance. Step 4. Resist Western pressure through economic diversification that prevents isolation. Step 5. Demonstrate improved security outcomes that prove new partnerships work better than Western military support. Every step in that template was tested successfully by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger between 2022 and 2025. We terminated defense agreements with France. We expelled French military forces despite warnings that security would collapse. We built comprehensive military partnership with Russia that provides equipment, training, intelligence, and advisors. We diversified our economies through Chinese investment that prevented Western economic leverage from forcing policy reversals. And we achieved security improvements that Western military support never delivered despite decades of French and American military presence in our region. Other African countries observed every step of that process and learned crucial lessons. They learned that Western predictions about collapse after expelling foreign forces were false. French officials warned that Mali would descend into chaos within months after French forces departed in August 2022. Mali's security situation actually stabilized by mid-2024 after Russian advisors arrived and Russian equipment reached Malian forces. They learned that Western threats of economic isolation were empty because Chinese trade and investment provided alternative markets and capital flows. Western financial institutions threatened to cut access to international credit after we expelled Western forces. Chinese development banks immediately offered financing with no political conditions attached. They learned that Russian military support delivers concrete results rather than process compliance requirements that characterized Western military partnerships. Listen carefully to what I am telling Pentagon strategists planning Africa policy for next decade. You cannot reverse what already happened in West Africa. 3 countries successfully demonstrated that Western military monopoly was never necessary for African security. That demonstration established precedent that other African nations will follow because it proves alternatives work better. Your threats of aid cuts cannot prevent that shift because Chinese economic engagement provides alternative funding. Your warnings about Russian unreliability cannot stop African countries from testing partnerships that Western monopoly previously prevented. Your appeals to shared democratic values cannot restore Western military dominance because African governments prioritize sovereignty over Western approval. The transformation of African security architecture from Western monopoly to multipolar system is irreversible because the precedent we established cannot be undone. Pentagon cannot make African countries forget that Burkina Faso expelled Western forces and improved security through Russian partnership. Western media cannot convince African governments that alternatives to Western military support do not exist when those alternatives currently operate across West Africa. Western officials cannot restore assumptions about permanent Western military dominance when 3 African countries permanently terminated that dominance in their territories. The precedent exists. The proof works. And African countries across entire continent are learning those lessons right now. Specific examples demonstrate how rapidly this transformation is accelerating. Somalia's government announced review of Western military agreements in November 2025 after observing AES success with alternative security partnerships. Uganda's defense ministry held consultations with Russian military officials in October 2025 about potential cooperation agreements. Nigeria's opposition parties criticized continued reliance on Western military support in December 2025 and cited Burkina Faso's Russian partnership as more effective alternative. These developments span East Africa, West Africa, and are beginning to influence Southern African security discussions. Pentagon is watching its military monopoly dissolve across entire continents simultaneously. The speed of this transformation reveals how fragile Western military dominance actually was. Pentagon assumed African countries accepted Western military presence because they believed it served their interests. Reality was African governments tolerated Western military presence because they thought no alternatives existed. The moment viable alternative appeared through Russian partnership, African countries immediately began reconsidering Western military relationships. That immediate reconsideration proves Western military monopoly was maintained through lack of alternatives rather than through genuine preference for Western partnerships. Pentagon's 70-year military dominance in Africa was built on foundation that crumbled the instant alternatives became available. Part 2. Pentagon's Failed Legacy versus Sovereign African Security, 1,200 words. Your legacy, Pentagon, is declining military dominance in Africa because you assumed African countries would permanently accept Western security partnerships even when those partnerships failed to meet our security needs. You thought military aid and training programs would generate permanent influence. You believed Africa Command and Forward bases would maintain American military presence indefinitely. You watched African countries request Western military support for decades and assumed that dependence was permanent. You were completely wrong. Russian military partnership proves African countries can build effective security relationships independent of Western dominance. Pentagon's strategic error was treating African security needs as secondary consideration to American political preferences. American military aid came with mandatory compliance requirements regarding democracy, human rights, governance reforms, and operational restrictions. Those requirements served American political interests by ensuring African partners conformed to American values. But those requirements simultaneously undermined operational effectiveness by preventing African forces from conducting military operations that violated American human rights standards, even when those operations were necessary for national security. Specific examples demonstrate how Western political conditions undermined African security operations. Western military support prohibited use of heavy weapons in populated areas, even when insurgents deliberately operated from civilian locations. Western intelligence sharing included restrictions preventing African forces from conducting immediate operations against time-sensitive targets. Western training programs focused on human rights, compliance, and rules of engagement rather than combat effectiveness against irregular forces. Western equipment came with monitoring systems that allowed Western partners to track how African forces used that equipment and intervene if usage violated Western standards. Every single aspect of Western military support prioritized Western political preferences over African operational effectiveness. Russian military partnership eliminates all those restrictions. Russian equipment comes with no monitoring systems and no usage restrictions. Russian intelligence sharing provides actionable information with no caveats about how African forces can use that intelligence. Russian training programs focus exclusively on combat effectiveness rather than compliance with international humanitarian law. Russian advisors evaluate African forces based on results achieved rather than processes followed. That fundamental difference in partnership approach explains why Russian military support delivers better security outcomes than Western military aid that came with conditions undermining operational effectiveness. Listen carefully. Pentagon officials reviewing why American military influence declined across Africa. Your legacy is military monopoly that you squandered through arrogance and complacency. You assumed African countries had no choice but to accept Western military partnerships because alternatives did not exist. That assumption was correct for decades after Cold War ended in early 1990s. But that assumption became catastrophically wrong when Russia returned to Africa as serious military partner in early 2020s. You failed to recognize that African countries tolerated Western political conditions only because viable alternatives were unavailable. The moment Russian partnership offered alternative without political conditions, African governments immediately reconsidered Western military relationships that never actually served African security interests as effectively as they could have. My legacy is finalizing strategic military alliance with Russia that provides equipment, training, intelligence, and advisors that Western partners refused to provide or provided with conditions that undermined our sovereignty. I traveled to Moscow on the 14th of October 2025 and signed agreement that fundamentally transforms African security architecture. I brought Russian military advisors to Burkina Faso who focus on effectiveness rather than process compliance. I secured advanced weapons that give us capabilities Western partners withheld. I built partnership with Russia that respects our sovereignty rather than attempting to control our governance. The contrast between Western military support and Russian military partnership is visible in concrete operational outcomes. Western military aid to Burkina Faso between 2015 and 2022 totaled over $400 million, but security situation deteriorated continuously throughout that entire period. Insurgent groups expanded territorial control from less than 5% of national territory in 2015 to over 35% by late 2022. Displaced population increased from fewer than 50,000 people in 2015 to over 2 million by 2022. Economic activity in northern regions collapsed completely as insurgent violence made agriculture, mining, and commerce impossible. Every metric of security deteriorated despite hundreds of millions of dollars in Western military aid and presence of Western military advisors supposedly training Burkina forces. Russian military partnership produced opposite trajectory. Russian advisors arrived in Burkina Faso in late 2023. Russian equipment began reaching our forces in early 2024. Russian intelligence sharing started in mid-2024. By early 2025, insurgent territorial control declined to less than 10% of national territory. Displaced population decreased as over 1.5 million people returned to their homes in areas where security improved. Economic activity resumed in previously contested regions as government forces equipped with Russian support established security conditions allowing normal life to return. Every metric improved under Russian partnership in time frame of 18 months compared to 7 years of deterioration under Western military support. Those concrete outcomes prove Russian military partnership delivers better results than Western military aid. Pentagon cannot dispute those facts. Western officials cannot explain why security deteriorated under Western support but improved under Russian partnership. Western media cannot convince African audiences that Russian military cooperation is inferior when evidence proves opposite. The results speak for themselves, and African countries across continent are studying those results very carefully when evaluating their own security partnerships. History will remember who defended African sovereignty by building military partnerships that serve African interests rather than accepting Western military dominance that served Western interests. The answer is written in Russian helicopters flying combat missions over Burkina Faso skies. It is documented in Russian armored vehicles protecting our troops in combat operations. It is proven in improved security situation as our forces equipped with Russian support achieve results that Western-supported operations never accomplished. Every prediction you made about African countries remaining dependent on Western military support proved false. The permanence of this transformation cannot be overstated. Pentagon cannot restore Western military monopoly in Africa because the precedent we established through Alliance of Sahel states destroyed assumptions that monopoly depended on. African countries now know alternatives exist. They observed alternatives work effectively. They learned that Western predictions about catastrophe were false. They recognize that multipolar security order serves African sovereignty better than Western dominance. Those lessons cannot be unlearned. That knowledge cannot be erased. And the transformation those lessons generate cannot be reversed, regardless of what Pentagon attempts to restore Western military influence. Part 3. Concrete evidence of Russian military effectiveness versus Western failure. 1,300 words. Listen carefully, Washington and Brussels. Your era of military monopoly in Africa ended when I signed that agreement in Moscow. Russian advisors are training our forces. Russian equipment is defending our territory. Russian intelligence is supporting our operations. And nothing you do will reverse this strategic partnership that serves both Russian and African interests. This is multipolar security order in Africa where we choose partners based on effectiveness rather than accepting Western dominance because alternatives exist and work better. The evidence of Russian military effectiveness in Alliance of Sahel states' territories is comprehensive and indisputable. Mali provides clearest example of transformation from Western military failure to Russian partnership success. French Operation Barkhane deployed over 5,000 troops, dozens of combat helicopters, fighter aircraft, armed drones, and special operations forces across Mali from 2014 to 2022. That massive military presence cost French government over €1 billion annually and involved most advanced Western military capabilities available. Despite that enormous investment of resources and capabilities, security situation in Mali deteriorated continuously throughout entire period of French military presence. Insurgent groups expanded territorial control in northern Mali from approximately 20% in 2014 to over 40% by 2021. Attacks on Malian military positions increased from fewer than 100 incidents annually in 2014 to over 600 incidents in 2021. Civilian casualties from insurgent violence escalated from fewer than 500 deaths in 2014 to over 2,000 deaths in 2021. Every single metric of security worsened despite French military presence that French officials characterized as essential for Malian stability. French military support clearly failed to achieve stated objectives of degrading insurgent capabilities and improving security situation. Russian military advisors arrived in Mali in early 2023 after Mali expelled French forces in August 2022. Russian deployment was substantially smaller than French presence, approximately 1,000 advisors compared to 5,000 French troops. Russian equipment provided to Malian forces included helicopters, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and air defense capabilities, but represented fraction of what French forces deployed. Yet security outcomes under Russian partnership dramatically outperformed results achieved under French military presence. By late 2024, insurgent territorial control in Mali declined to approximately 15% of national territory. Attacks on Malian positions decreased to fewer than 300 incidents annually. Civilian casualties from insurgent violence dropped below 1,000 deaths annually. Malian forces, equipped with Russian support and trained by Russian advisors, conducted successful operations that reclaimed territory French forces never secured during 8 years of Operation Barkhane. The operational effectiveness of Russian military partnership substantially exceeded French military presence despite smaller deployment and lower resource commitment. Similar patterns emerged in Niger and Burkina Faso. Niger hosted American drone base that operated surveillance flights across entire Sahel region from 2013 to 2024. American intelligence collection provided detailed information about insurgent movements, locations, and activities. American Special Operations Forces trained Nigerian troops in counter-terrorism tactics and advised Nigerian commanders on operational planning. Yet security situation in Niger deteriorated throughout period of American military presence. Insurgent attacks increased, territorial control expanded, casualties escalated. American military support failed to prevent security deterioration despite sophisticated intelligence capabilities and extensive training programs. Niger expelled American forces in May 2024 and initiated security cooperation with Russia immediately afterward. Russian advisors focused on building Nigerian military capabilities for sustained operations rather than conducting training exercises that produced no lasting improvements. Russian equipment emphasized mobility and firepower that enabled Nigerian forces to conduct offensive operations rather than defensive postures that characterized American-supported approach. Russian intelligence sharing provided actionable information Nigerian forces could immediately exploit rather than intelligence with restrictions preventing timely operations. Within 12 months of Russian partnership beginning, Niger's security situation stabilized and began improving in ways American military presence never achieved during over 10 years of operations. Burkina Faso's experience mirrors Mali and Niger. Western military support to Burkina Faso from 2015 to 2022 included French military advisors, American training programs, equipment donations from multiple Western countries, and intelligence sharing from French and American sources. That comprehensive Western military support proved completely inadequate to prevent insurgent expansion across northern Burkina Faso. Security collapsed despite Western military presence. Government authority evaporated from entire regions. Over 2 million people fled their homes. Western military support failed catastrophically to meet Burkinabe security needs. The scale of Western military engagement in Burkina Faso during those 7 years was substantial and comprehensive. France deployed military advisors who embedded with Burkinabe armed forces at battalion and brigade levels. Those advisors supposedly provided tactical guidance, operational planning support, and strategic consultation to Burkinabe commanders. United States Africa Command conducted over 30 separate training missions between 2015 and 2022, covering counterterrorism tactics, intelligence operations, logistics management, and leadership development. European Union established training mission in Burkina Faso in 2018 that deployed over 200 trainers from multiple European countries. Canada provided intelligence support through surveillance aircraft and signals intelligence capabilities. Multiple Western countries donated equipment including vehicles, communication systems, night vision devices, and small arms. That extensive Western military support should have produced security improvements if Western military partnerships actually served African security interests effectively. Western advisors brought supposedly superior tactical knowledge from Western military doctrines. Western training programs emphasized professional military standards and modern operational techniques. Western equipment provided technological advantages over insurgent forces. Western intelligence capabilities offered surveillance and information collection that African countries could not generate independently. Every element of Western military support was presented as essential for African security and superior to alternatives. Yet, security situation in Burkina Faso deteriorated catastrophically throughout entire period of Western military presence. Insurgent groups that controlled less than 5% of national territory in 2015 expanded to over 35% by late 2022. Attacks on military positions increased from fewer than 100 incidents annually in 2015 to over 800 incidents in 2022. Civilian casualties from insurgent violence escalated from approximately 300 deaths in 2015 to over 4,000 deaths in 2022. Internally displaced population grew from fewer than 50,000 people in 2015 to over 2 million by 2022. Economic activity collapsed across entire northern regions as insurgent control made agriculture, mining, commerce, and normal life impossible. Government authority simply evaporated from vast territories despite presence of Western military advisors, despite Western training programs, despite Western equipment donations, and despite Western intelligence support. Listen carefully to what that catastrophic failure reveals about Western military partnerships. Western military support to Burkina Faso was comprehensive, sustained, well-resourced, and delivered by supposedly most professional military establishments in the world. Yet that Western support produced complete security collapse. Western advisors could not prevent insurgent expansion. Western training programs did not improve Burkina operational effectiveness. Western equipment failed to provide decisive advantages. Western intelligence did not enable successful counterinsurgency operations. Every single component of Western military support failed to achieve stated objectives despite 7 years of intensive engagement and hundreds of millions of dollars invested. Western officials consistently blamed that failure on Burkina governance problems, corruption within Burkina military, insufficient Burkina commitment to democratic reforms, and human rights violations by Burkina security forces. That blame shifting was predictable and dishonest. Western military support came with extensive political conditions requiring governance reforms, anti-corruption measures, democratic institution building, and human rights compliance. If those requirements were actually necessary for security improvements, then Western military support should have been conditioned on meeting those requirements before providing assistance. Instead, Western countries provided military support despite supposedly inadequate governance, then blamed governance failures when security collapsed. That circular logic revealed Western military support prioritized maintaining Western influence over achieving security results. The previous Burkina government of President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore fully cooperated with Western military partnerships. Kabore maintained all defense agreements with France. Kabore welcomed American military training programs. Kabore accepted Western political conditions regarding governance and human rights. Kabore implemented reforms Western partners demanded. Kabore's government represented ideal Western partner in Africa, democratic, cooperative, compliant with Western preferences. Yet security under Kabore's Western-aligned government collapsed so completely that over 2 million Burkina fled their homes and entire regions fell under insurgent control. Western military support failed the most cooperative African partner imaginable. I took power on the 30th of September 2022, specifically because previous governments' reliance on Western military support produced security catastrophe. I expelled French forces. I terminated defense agreements with France. I closed Western military cooperation programs. I built partnership with Russia that provided equipment Western partners withheld and training focused on effectiveness rather than compliance. By early 2025, security situation in Burkina Faso improved dramatically. Insurgent territorial control declined from 35% to less than 10%. Displaced population decreased as 1.5 million people returned home. Government authority was restored across regions that Western military support never secured. Russian partnership delivered results Western military aid failed to achieve despite 7 years of effort and hundreds of millions of dollars invested. The contrast between Western failure and Russian success in Burkina Faso is documented in specific operational outcomes that Pentagon cannot dispute. Western military support emphasized training Burkina forces in counterinsurgency doctrine that prioritized winning civilian support through governance improvements and development projects. That approach produced zero territorial gains and continuous insurgent expansion throughout 7 years of implementation. Russian military advisors focused on combat effectiveness and offensive operations that prioritized defeating insurgent forces through superior mobility and firepower. That approach produced territorial gains across northern Burkina Faso within 18 months of implementation. Western military aid included light vehicles and small arms suitable for patrols and defensive positions but inadequate for sustained offensive operations. Burkina forces equipped with Western supplies could defend static positions but lacked capabilities for mobile operations necessary to reclaim insurgent-controlled territories. Russian military support included armored vehicles, heavy weapons, artillery systems, and combat helicopters that enabled Burkina forces to conduct offensive operations that Western equipment could never support. Within 12 months of receiving Russian equipment, Burkina forces reclaimed territories that remained under insurgent control throughout the entire period of Western military presence. Western intelligence sharing provided information about insurgent locations and activities, but included restrictions preventing immediate military action against time-sensitive targets. Western intelligence came with caveats requiring verification, coordination with Western partners, and compliance with international humanitarian law before Burkina forces could conduct operations. Those restrictions meant intelligence lost operational value by time all Western requirements were satisfied. Russian intelligence sharing provided actionable information with no restrictions on how Burkina forces used that intelligence. Russian approach enabled Burkina forces to conduct immediate operations against insurgent targets, while intelligence remained current and operationally useful. Western training programs focused on human rights compliance, rules of engagement, civilian protection protocols, and administrative procedures that consumed training time without improving combat effectiveness. Burkina soldiers trained by Western programs learned how to document incidents for legal compliance but not how to defeat insurgent forces in actual combat. Russian training programs focused exclusively on combat skills, tactical proficiency, operational planning, and mission execution. Burkina soldiers trained by Russian advisors learned how to fight effectively rather than how to comply with Western bureaucratic requirements. The results speak conclusively. Security deteriorated under Western military support and improved under Russian military partnership. Insurgent territorial control expanded under Western presence and contracted under Russian cooperation. Displaced population increased under Western aid and decreased under Russian assistance. Government authority collapsed under Western advisors and was restored under Russian partnership. Every single metric demonstrates Russian military cooperation delivers superior results compared to Western military support, regardless of Western claims about technological superiority and professional standards. Listen carefully. Pentagon officials still claiming Western military partnerships serve African interests better than Russian alternatives. Burkina Faso's experience proves you are completely wrong. Your comprehensive military support produced catastrophic security failure. Your advisors, your training programs, your equipment donations, your intelligence sharing all failed to prevent complete security collapse. Russian military partnerships succeeded where Western military support failed. Russian advisors, Russian training, Russian equipment, Russian intelligence delivered security improvements Western presence never achieved. Those facts destroy your narrative about Western military superiority and prove Russian partnerships work better for African security needs. Western officials predicted Burkina Faso would descend into chaos after I expelled French forces and terminated Western military cooperation. French Foreign Ministry issued warnings in late 2022 that Burkina Faso's security would collapse within months without French military support. American Africa Command assessed in early 2023 that Burkina Faso faced imminent state failure after closing Western military programs. European Union officials forecasted in mid-2023 that Burkina Faso would become failed state, requiring international intervention after rejecting Western security partnerships. Every single Western prediction proved completely false. Burkina Faso did not collapse. Our security improved. Our government strengthened. Our sovereignty expanded. Western predictions were designed to intimidate African countries into maintaining Western military dominance rather than honest assessments of what would actually happen after rejecting Western control. The improved security situation in Burkina Faso by early 2025 was visible in concrete measurable outcomes. Insurgent territorial control declined from 35% of national territory in late 2022 to less than 10% by early 2025. That represented reclamation of over 25% of national territory, approximately 67,000 square kilometers within approximately 24 months. Western military support never reclaimed any territory during 7 years of presence. Russian military partnership enabled reclamation of vast territories within 2 years. Displaced population decreased from over 2 million people in late 2022 to approximately 500,000 by early 2025. That represented return of 1.5 million internally displaced persons to their homes within 2 years. Western military presence presided over continuous increase in displaced population. Russian military cooperation enabled massive return of displaced population in short time frame. Economic activity resumed across northern regions where security improved under Russian partnership. Markets reopened in towns that were abandoned during insurgent control. Agricultural production resumed in rural areas where farmers returned after displaced population came home. Mining operations restarted in regions where security conditions improved enough to protect workers and equipment. Government services were restored in communities where territorial control returned to Burkina Faso authorities. Every indicator of normal life improved dramatically after Russian military partnership replaced Western military support that produced only deterioration. The permanent lesson from Burkina Faso's experience is that Russian military partnerships deliver superior security outcomes compared to Western military support, regardless of what Western officials claim about their supposedly advanced capabilities and professional standards. That lesson is documented in concrete facts that cannot be disputed. Security collapsed under Western military presence. Security improved under Russian military partnership. Western military support failed. Russian military cooperation succeeded. African countries studying Burkina Faso's experience learn clear message. Russian partnerships work better than Western military aid. And that lesson will reshape African security choices across entire continent as other countries follow precedent we established by rejecting Western military control and building effective alternative through partnership with Russia that time-starred basic serves our sovereignty rather than Western dominance. Listen carefully to pattern that emerges from Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso experiences. Western military presence was larger, better equipped, more expensive, and longer duration than Russian partnerships. Yet Russian military cooperation delivered superior security outcomes in substantially shorter timeframes with fewer resources. Pentagon cannot explain that pattern without admitting Western military support prioritized Western political interests over African operational effectiveness. French officials cannot justify Operation Barkhane's failure without acknowledging French military presence served French strategic objectives rather than Malian security needs. American Africa Command cannot rationalize deteriorating security across Sahel despite American military involvement without conceding American military aid came with restrictions that prevented effective operations. The evidence is overwhelming and undeniable. Russian military partnership works better than Western military support. African forces equipped with Russian weapons and trained by Russian advisors achieve results that Western military aid failed to produce. Security situations improve under Russian cooperation after deteriorating under Western military presence. Those facts destroy Pentagon's narrative about Russian military inferiority and Western partnership superiority. African countries studying these outcomes learn clear lesson. Russian military cooperation delivers better results than Western military support regardless of what Western officials claim about Western technological advantages and professional military standards. That lesson has immediate and profound implications for African security choices moving forward. Why would any African country continue accepting Western military aid that comes with political conditions undermining operational effectiveness when Russian military partnership delivers better results without those conditions? Why would African governments tolerate Western restrictions on equipment usage when Russian support includes no such limitations? Why would African forces accept Western training focused on process compliance when Russian training emphasizes combat effectiveness? The logical answer is, African countries will increasingly choose Russian military partnerships over Western military support because evidence proves Russian cooperation serves African security interests better. The military alliance between Russia and Alliance of Sahel, states Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, represents permanent transformation of African security architecture. We demonstrated that African countries can successfully build comprehensive military partnerships independent of Western control. We proved that Russian support delivers better results than Western military aid that came with political conditions undermining our sovereignty. We showed that Pentagon's military monopoly in Africa was never necessary for African security, it only served American strategic interests. Pentagon officials warned for years that Russian military expansion in Africa would threaten stability. Those warnings were accurate in predicting Russian presence but completely wrong in their conclusions. Russian military bases exist across West Africa today. Russian advisors train our forces. Russian equipment defends our territories. Russian intelligence supports our operations. And all of that improves African security rather than threatening it, because Russian partnership serves African interests rather than attempting to control African governance. The permanence of this transformation stems from fundamental shift in African understanding of security partnerships. For decades after independence, African countries assumed Western military support was necessary for national security because Western powers possessed most advanced military technology, most professional armed forces, and most sophisticated intelligence capabilities. That assumption made African governments tolerate Western political conditions as unavoidable cost of accessing essential military support. African countries accepted Western restrictions on equipment usage, Western requirements for governance reforms, and Western interference in operational decisions because they believed effective military partnerships required accepting those Western demands. Alliance of Sahel states partnership with Russia destroyed that assumption permanently. We proved African countries can access advanced military technology from non-Western sources. We demonstrated African forces can receive professional training from advisors who prioritize effectiveness over compliance with Western political preferences. We showed African governments can obtain sophisticated intelligence support without accepting restrictions that undermine operational utility. We established that effective military partnerships do not require accepting political conditions that compromise sovereignty. Those proofs cannot be undone. That knowledge cannot be erased. And African understanding of security partnerships transformed permanently as a result of lessons we established through our alliance with Russia. This alliance establishes precedent that will reshape African security choices across entire continent. Other African countries now know that alternatives to Western military dominance exist and work effectively. They watched us expel Western forces and improve security through Russian partnership. They observed that Western predictions about our collapse proved completely false. They learned that multipolar security order offers better outcomes than accepting permanent Western military control. Specific African countries are already acting on these lessons in ways that fundamentally threaten Pentagon's remaining military presence across continent. Central African Republic government announced in December 2025 that Russian military advisors would train new elite units for Presidential Guard and Special Operations Forces. That announcement came despite French warnings that Russian military cooperation would trigger sanctions and aid cuts. Central African Republic government proceeded anyway because they observed Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger successfully resisted similar Western threats. Chad's government is conducting quiet consultations with Russian defense officials about potential cooperation agreements, despite American pressure to maintain exclusive Western military relationships. Chad learned from AES experience that Western threats of consequences are largely empty when African countries have alternatives through Russian partnership and Chinese economic support. Even countries with historically close Western military relationships are reconsidering those partnerships in light of AES success with Russian cooperation. Kenya maintained extensive military cooperation with United States and United Kingdom for decades. Yet Kenyan defense officials held exploratory discussions with Russian military representatives in November 2025 about potential cooperation in specific capability areas where Western partners imposed restrictions. Those discussions would have been unthinkable 3 years ago when African countries assumed Western military monopoly was permanent and alternatives did not exist. AES partnership with Russia made those discussions possible by proving alternatives work effectively. Listen carefully one final time. Pentagon. 3 African nations just allied with Russia in comprehensive military partnership. Your military monopoly in West Africa is finished. Your Africa Command cannot restore American dominance. Your threats of aid cuts and sanctions will not reverse this alliance. Russian advisors, Russian equipment, Russian intelligence, and Russian political support replaced everything Pentagon provided and delivered better results. This is new era in African security where we choose partners who serve our interests, and nothing you do will restore Western military control that we permanently rejected. Your era ended. Our sovereignty begins. Pentagon's strategic options for countering Russian military expansion in Africa are severely limited because every potential response has already been attempted unsuccessfully. Pentagon could threaten to cut military aid to African countries that partner with Russia. That threat failed in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger because Russian military support replaced American aid. Pentagon could impose sanctions on African governments that cooperate with Russian military forces. Those sanctions failed because Chinese economic engagement provided alternative trade and investment that prevented economic isolation. Pentagon could increase military aid to countries that maintain exclusive Western partnerships. That approach failed because African countries observed that larger Western military presence in Mali and Burkina Faso produced worse security outcomes than smaller Russian deployment. Pentagon could attempt to compete directly with Russian military partnerships by offering African countries similar support without political conditions. But Pentagon cannot actually implement that approach because American military aid is legally required to include human rights conditions and governance requirements. United States Congress mandates those conditions through legislation like Leahy Law that prohibits military aid to foreign forces that commit human rights violations. Pentagon cannot provide military support without political conditions, even if Pentagon strategists recognize those conditions undermine American influence. American domestic politics prevent Pentagon from competing effectively with Russian military partnerships that come without governance requirements. This structural constraint represents fundamental weakness in American strategy toward Africa that Pentagon cannot overcome regardless of how urgently American officials recognize the problem. Pentagon strategists clearly understand that political conditions attached to American military aid drive African countries toward Russian partnerships that come without those restrictions. Pentagon analysts accurately assess that Russian military cooperation gains influence specifically because Russia provides support without governance requirements that American law mandates. Pentagon planners recognize that competing effectively with Russian partnerships would require offering African countries military support comparable to what Russia provides without political conditions that compromise African operational effectiveness. But Pentagon cannot implement that strategic response because American domestic political system prevents it. United States Congress will not repeal Leahy Law or eliminate human rights conditions from military aid legislation. American human rights organizations would immediately mobilize against any attempt to provide military support to African forces without compliance monitoring and governance requirements. American media would condemn Pentagon for supporting African governments that conduct military operations violating Western human rights standards. American domestic politics make it impossible for Pentagon to compete with Russian military partnerships on terms that would actually appeal to African countries seeking support without political conditions. Listen carefully to what this means for Pentagon's strategic position in Africa. Pentagon is structurally incapable of offering African countries what they actually want from military partnerships: effective support without political conditions that undermine sovereignty. Pentagon can only offer military aid that comes with extensive governance requirements, human rights compliance monitoring, operational restrictions, and political interference that African countries increasingly reject because Russian alternatives exist. Pentagon cannot change that fundamental constraint regardless of how clearly Pentagon strategists understand it undermines American influence. American domestic politics prevent Pentagon from competing effectively with Russia for African military partnerships. The structural constraints on American military aid explain why Pentagon cannot reverse Russian military expansion in Africa through traditional tools of American power. Pentagon's military monopoly in Africa was built on assumption that African countries had no alternatives to Western military support. That assumption is permanently false. Russian military partnerships provide comprehensive alternative that works better for African sovereignty than Western military aid that came with political conditions. Pentagon cannot restore monopoly that depended on African countries having no choices when viable alternatives now exist and produce superior results. Pentagon's only remaining strategic option is attempting to convince African countries that Western military partnerships serve African interests better than Russian cooperation, despite all evidence proving opposite. That persuasion strategy is doomed to fail because African countries can directly observe outcomes in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, where Russian military support delivered security improvements that Western military presence never achieved. Pentagon cannot convince African governments to ignore evidence from their own continent showing Russian partnerships work more effectively than Western military aid. Pentagon cannot persuade African populations to disbelieve what they can see with their own eyes. Russian military cooperation produces better security results than Western military support that came with political conditions undermining operational effectiveness. Pentagon could increase military aid to African countries that maintain exclusive Western partnerships, attempting to outspend Russian military engagement. But that approach fails because the problem is not insufficient quantity of Western military support. The problem is political conditions attached to that support that prevent African forces from conducting effective operations. Providing more Western military aid with same restrictive conditions will not compete successfully with Russian military partnerships that deliver support without those conditions. African countries do not need more Western military aid. They need military support that actually serves their security needs without political interference. Russia provides that. Pentagon cannot because American law prevents it. Western military control of African security ended permanently because the foundation that control rested on African dependence on Western military support was destroyed by emergence of Russian military partnerships that deliver better outcomes without political conditions compromising sovereignty. Pentagon cannot rebuild that foundation. Western military monopoly cannot be restored. African countries will not voluntarily return to Western military dominance that served Western interests rather than African security needs. The transformation is permanent. The multipolar security order is established. And African sovereignty and security partnerships begins with alliance of Sahel states, but will spread across entire continent as other African countries learn lessons we proved through our military alliance with Russia. Your 70 years of military monopoly are finished, Pentagon. Our era of genuine security sovereignty has begun. And history will record that 3 African nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, ended Western military domination of African continent by proving alternatives exist and work better. That is our legacy. That is your defeat. And nothing you do will change what we accomplished permanently. Pentagon's strategic defeat in Africa is absolute and irreversible. You cannot offer what African countries want because American law prevents it. You cannot restore military monopoly that depended on African countries having no alternatives when viable alternatives now exist. You cannot compete with Russian military partnerships that deliver support without political conditions when American domestic politics require those conditions. You cannot reverse what Alliance of Sahel states accomplished by proving Russian cooperation works better than Western military aid. Your era of dominance ended not because you lost military capabilities, but because you lost African trust by prioritizing Western political interests over African security needs for 70 years. Russian military partnerships succeeded by offering what the Pentagon cannot provide: effective support that respects African sovereignty. That fundamental difference explains why Pentagon's military monopoly in Africa ended permanently, and why nothing Pentagon attempts will restore Western military control that African countries permanently rejected.